All right, hi folks who are joining. We'll get going in a minute or two. Just wait for people to keep trickling in. In the meantime, maybe I'll share my screen.
All right, I need to get different mic here. Speaker still slumber. Working. All right,
See, there we go. All right, I'm trying to get it full screen. How does that look for folks? We can see it okay. I see some thumbs up. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this meeting that we're calling the Flood Safety Act and Beyond, statewide and local efforts to address flooding in the Northeast Kingdom. As you can see, this particular meeting is a collaboration between many organizations, and you'll hear from them shortly, but we're also joined by Memphremagog, Watershed Association, Northeast Vermont Development Association, Caledonia County, Orleans County, and Essex County Natural Resource Conservation Districts, the Connecticut River Conservancy, Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, the Nature Conservancy, and Lake Champlain Sea Grant. I think I got them all. My name is Allison. I work for Lake Champlain Sea Grant. My co-host tonight, who's going to be speaking with me, is also Shane. So Shane, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Shane Jakewith. I am the Watershed Restoration Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy here in Vermont.
Great. All right, so a few housekeeping reminders. So this is Teams. If you're not as familiar with this platform, the mute is this button. We do ask that folks keep themselves on mute just to minimize background noise while folks are giving presentations. And then at the end, if you want to take yourself off mute and ask questions, that's totally fine. There is a chat feature just like Zoom. So if you have questions that you want to put in there while we are talking, feel free to do that. We do have folks who are monitoring that because I can't see it while I am sharing my screen. And then when we get to the Q&A at the end, feel free to also raise your hand. That's a nice way to let us know that you want to ask your question in front of the group. So the agenda for tonight, we're going to hear from some introductions from Vermont DEC. Then myself and Shane will spend some time talking about the Flood Safety Act. And then we're going to hear from some local organizations about some of their own efforts and their perspective on this issue. And so we're going to hear from the Connecticut River Conservancy, then the Memphremagog Watershed Association, then Caledonia County, Orleans County, and Essex County Natural Resource Conservation Districts, and Northeast Vermont Development Association. And since we have a packed schedule, we're going to do the Q&A at the end for any of the people who you are hearing from tonight, but feel free to use the chat to put questions in as we go. I do want to open the floor up to Alexis and Sasha from DEC. So I guess, Alexis, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Nevins, Vermont DEC River and Floodplain Manager for Orleans, Essex, Lamoille, Caledonia, and Orange counties. What I do at DEC is work with, assisting communities with their floodplain regulations or bylaws, provide technical assistance on floodplain permit applications, mapping, National Flood Insurance Program obligations, and kind of just any general floodplain or river corridor questions. I also issue state flood hazard area and river corridor permits for activities that municipalities cannot regulate like state-owned or operated facilities, some agricultural practices, and things like power generation, transmission, or telecommunication facilities. And I also provide comments on the floodplain and river corridor portion of Act 250 proceedings to the Land Use Review Board. My contact information is shown on the screen, as well as the other regional floodplain managers, in case you're listening in from another area. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. And Alexis will definitely be useful in our Q&A too, if there's some more technical questions. Sasha, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So glad you all could be here tonight. My name is Sasha Peeler, and I work for the Department of Environmental Conservation Rivers Program, currently as a river scientist for Northeastern Vermont, and in the past did a lot of the work that Alexis is now doing. Some of my work currently involves river corridor mapping and the geomorphic assessment data that goes along with that. And I work with partners like the conservation districts and the watershed groups to look at river restoration projects as well. But I also try to spend time with the communities to learn what flood issues they're facing in options for mitigating flood concerns. So anyway, my name is Sasha Peeler, and I'm happy to see you all.
Thanks, Sasha. So to kick things off, we're first going to be talking about the Flood Safety Act, otherwise known as Act 121. This particular education and outreach effort is a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, Lake Champlain Sea Grant, and it's all in support of Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And so the goal of tonight and this portion of our meeting tonight is to give you some background, details, and timeline related to the Flood Safety Act, and then certainly answer your questions about what does this mean for my community or my region. And so we're thankful to have some of our regional DEC folks on the call tonight too. So to kick things off, we're going to be spending a good amount of tonight talking about river corridors. And so I think it's important just to clarify what we mean by that, make sure everyone's on the same page. So river corridors are the mapped areas on either side of the river where we expect the river channel to adjust over time. Many of us are probably familiar with the fact that rivers move over time. They change shape in response to changes in water flow and sediment and human alterations and things like that. And so allowing the river room to move allows it to find its slowest and least erosive path down a valley. And so we will be talking a little bit more about this later, but to kind of give some of the background about our topic tonight, the Flood Safety Act was passed in 2024 after the historic flooding that our state saw in 2023. And this rainfall map that's on the slide here shows total rainfall from the July 10th and 11th storm of 2023. And if it's hard to read, those pink and purple areas are areas where the state saw 5, 6, 7 plus inches of rainfall in a short period of time. And so I think this is important to show just because extreme precipitation and then the flooding that eventually follows doesn't follow town or county boundaries. And we know that the most successful flood mitigation efforts are often those that are taken at a watershed-wide approach, so that all towns upstream and downstream have similar protections, making us all safer. And so because a lot of what the Flood Safety Act does is statewide, that also in effect creates a watershed-wide approach. So the Flood Safety Act aims to mitigate flood risk in multiple ways. It first establishes state regulation of proposed development in river corridors. So we are going to be spending most of this part talking about this part of the act, but I think it's important to mention also that it creates statewide minimum standards for development in National Flood Insurance Program enrolled towns. And so if folks have questions about that, I'm sure that Alexis and Sasha can help us out on that part. But also the act itself strengthens dam safety through increased oversight and maintenance requirements. And then finally aims to increase floodwater storage in wetlands by establishing a net gain wetland rule, because we know that wetlands are the important areas on our landscape that can act as sponges and help buffer us against heavy precipitation. So a quick overview of the timeline. I don't need to spend a lot of time here, but I think the important thing to know is that the administration of the rules that have to do with river corridor regulations will begin, we expect them to begin in January of 2028. Before then, there also is a 2-year education and outreach effort to collect input from the public. And so tonight is one of those efforts that's trying to kick that effort off. And then some of these other aspects we'll talk about shortly. So going back a little bit and providing some background for how we got here, this is just a list of some of the large and destructive floods that our state has experienced. And we know that flooding has affected Vermont as far back as 1869, probably even earlier than that. And for each of these storms, the damages have exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars, which has been adjusted for inflation. But even in between those large and destructive floods that maybe people have committed those years to memory, we also have a lot of smaller and regional flooding events that really affects all corners of our state. And so this is a map showing the areas of greatest damage from floods between 1973 and 2011. And what you'll notice is that almost on a 1 to 2 year basis, somewhere in the state is experiencing the impact of flooding. And we know that flooding is the most common and costly recurring hazard in Vermont. The Nature Conservancy did an analysis and found that Vermont spends around 30 million per year in flood-related damage. So when we are talking about the damage caused by flooding, it's good to distinguish between inundation and erosion. And so in Vermont, we often see inundation-related flooding when our rivers rise above their banks and spill out onto areas adjacent to the river that don't normally hold water on them. And the damage that we see from inundation-related flooding is really damage caused by things getting wet, whereas we also see damage caused by erosion, which is the undermining or wearing away of land alongside riverbanks. And we often see this causing extensive damage to our roads and our bridges and our other riverside infrastructure. And the state of Vermont has tallied up the damages associated with flooding over the years. And what we found is that over 75% of the monetary flooding damages are due to fluvial erosion in Vermont. And so the Flood Safety Act is an effort to address the damage caused by erosion, especially in part with what we're seeing with the changes to river corridors. And so with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Shane, who's going to give us a little bit more background.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, so these next four, I think it's 4 slides, are gonna focus on historic attempts to mitigate flood hazards and why those historic attempts haven't worked. So going back to European settlement, we've really tried to mitigate flood hazards by what you might call a command and control approach, right? When European settlers arrived, they dredged rivers to make them deeper, keep water in the channels, a practice that we have continued to this very day. They straightened rivers to get them out of the way of desired land uses such as transportation networks, agriculture, and buildings. And they armored those rivers to keep them moving either back to where they were before they were moved, or keep them where they were. So we've it's really been a long history of dredging straightening and armoring our channels as our primary flood hazard mitigation approach. You can advance the slide, Allison. So I mentioned that channel straightening was one of those historic practices. And I just want to talk a minute about why that hasn't really worked and what the outcomes of straightening have been. So on the top of the slide, we see a picture that actually happens to be from the West Branch of the Passumpsic. And, you know, it's a meandering channel, and that meandering path is a pretty long path from point A to B relative to the straight path shown by the blue line. And so with a bottom plot on that slide is just looking at those two paths from a side perspective, right? And we see that meandering, that dotted line representing the meander path is much longer than the solid line representing that straighter line from points A to B in that photograph. So if we all remember back to middle school math, we can remember that slope is a function of the vertical rise of a path over its horizontal distance. And we see that in this plot, right? Pretty simply, the straight blue line, the shorter path, is much steeper than the longer meandering channel. And that's important because there's this thing in hydraulics called stream power. And it's really just represents the amount of energy available in the stream to do work. And the two primary variables that are responsible for stream power are, one, the depth of the water in the stream, and that's because water has weight. So the deeper the water, the heavier the water, and weight translates into power. And the other is the slope of the channel. And that's simply because the greater the slope of the channel, the more that gravity is working with that flowing water, making it faster and more powerful. So when we straighten rivers, we make them shorter, we make them steeper, and we make them more powerful. That's the problem with channel straightening. One of the other three practices that I mentioned is the practice of dredging. I'm just going to talk a second about why dredging doesn't mitigate flood hazards and actually makes them worse. And this is an important one, right? Because I'm sure we're all well aware that dredging our rivers is often pointed to as what a lot of people think of as the obvious solution for mitigating flood hazards. And that might be true, at least for a short period of time, with respect to inundation hazard, that the water coming up over the banks that Allison described earlier. But when we dredge a channel to deal with inundation hazards, what we ultimately do is trade that inundation damage for erosion damage. And as Allison pointed out, and we think about inundation versus erosion damage, that erosion damage is much more costly than inundation damage. So what's the problem with dredging? Let's look at the three figures in this slide. Starting at the top, rivers in nature that haven't been dredged or otherwise stressed impacted by a lot of the stressors that humans tend to create are relatively shallow. They are shallower than most of the rivers that we see when we're out and about in Vermont. But that's important because those shallow channels have low banks. So when we're in the middle of a rain event, it doesn't take much of a rise in the water depth or water surface elevation before that water starts to flow out onto the floodplain. And that's important because I mentioned before that depth of the flow is one of the primary factors in generating stream power. So if we have this broad floodplain, we could think of it like as a pressure relief valve. It's a giant pressure relief valve. The water spreads out, it slows down. The depth in the main channel is governed because as that water spreads out, it can't really increase in depth all that much because there's just so much room on that broad floodplain. So that's a natural situation. The floodplain is the pressure relief valve. It governs the depth and the energy or power of the flow. If we look at the second figure, it's just the hypothetical where the homeowner gets tired of being flooded every few years, so they dig the channel deeper to try to hold all that water in the channel. One, not shown on this channel, you really can't create enough capacity by digging that channel deeper to contain all the water. Two, all that deeper water in that deeper channel means more weight and more velocity acting on the bed of and the banks of the channel. So eventually those banks just crumble, they collapse, and you end up with that erosion damage that we're so familiar with across Vermont. So that's the problem with dredging. You can advance the slide, Allison. Thank you. So how have Vermont's rivers responded to all of the historic channel management that we've implemented in an attempt to reduce flood hazards and damages? This is an image of what's referred to as a channel evolution model, starting at the top with a stable, undisturbed river. It's really pretty similar to what I just showed in the last slide. At the top, we have a channel in its natural condition, relatively shallow channel with a broad floodplain. And then in the second image down, what's labeled as stage 2, the incision stage, the homeowners berm the channel has a similar impact as dredging the channel because in effect you're making the channel deeper, increases the energy. We get that incision or gullying process. The channel actually deepens by erosion. The channel, the materials on the bed of the channel just wash downstream and the channel gets deeper over time. Eventually, the channel goes into a widening phase where the beds start to collapse and all that gravel comes in, builds big bars. That's referred to as the stabilizing stage. And we end up with a pretty similar configuration in stage 5, which is fairly stable with a small channel within a broad floodplain. That's the channel evolution process. Vermont has assessed about 5,000 miles of river. And for context, there are about 23,000 miles of river mapped throughout the state. So about 20%, and found that 75% of those miles that were assessed were in these stages 2, 3, and 4, these incised, widened, disconnected from their floodplain. They don't have access to that pressure relief valve. 75% of the streams assessed are in these really unstable conditions and just ripe for massive erosion during the next flood event. So that is really the outcome of all the years of the command and control approach to mitigating flood hazards across Vermont.
Okay, so thinking a little bit more about how our state is trying to mitigate flood risks. So we, along with much of the country, we rely on the National Flood Insurance Program to help insure properties against flood-related risks. And so communities in the state can choose to participate in the program. Then they have to regulate development in floodplains to a certain standard set by FEMA, and anyone who lives in the special flood hazard area and has a federally backed mortgage has to purchase flood insurance through the program. And so looking at this map, we're doing pretty good. We have all but 20 communities about participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so we may feel like, all right, we're doing good. We're building in ways that help mitigate risk, and we're also insuring our properties. But there is a few drawbacks to simply relying on this program alone. One of them is just simply that Vermont is a very rural state. We're also sometimes referred to as a headwater state. A lot of that 23,000 miles of streams is a lot of those small streams up in the mountains, like first order, second order streams, where we don't have mapped flood hazard data from FEMA for. This graph down here, it might be a little bit dated because it's from a few years ago, but it's just showing the amount of are rivers and streams that have flood hazard data mapped from FEMA. And so it's quite a small percentage when you're looking at all of our rivers and streams. So it doesn't address that kind of flashy nature of our small streams up in our headwaters that might be pretty benign for most of the year, but still can be quite damaging during extreme precipitation. Another issue is just simply that the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't address fluvial erosion hazards. That's not what it was designed to do. And so you can have situations where there is houses or infrastructure high above the floodplain, high above the 100-year floodplain that FEMA maps. And so they maybe have never had to purchase flood insurance, or they didn't realize that flooding was a risk. But being so close to the river, you can have a situation where erosion is really the hazard that causes the damage. And so with that being said, that brings us back to river corridors. And so Shane's gonna speak a little bit more to that.
Thanks, Allison. So here we are. We understand now that erosion hazards are our greatest, most expensive form are responsible for the most of our monetary costs during flood events. So it's erosion hazards. Our historic channel management approaches have not worked, or hazard mitigation approaches have not worked to mitigate those hazards. In fact, they've only made them worse. The NFIP program really isn't designed to deal with or mitigate erosion hazards. It's more focused on inundation hazards. So where do we go from here? And, how do we deal with this problem? And the answer to that question that the state came up with is river corridors. River corridors, as Allison mentioned, they're the areas in which we expect the river to move over time. If we can allow the river to move, to lengthen its path, to decrease its slope, reduce the amount of power it has, we will more effectively mitigate the erosion damages. And if we understand where the river is going to move, we can keep our developments out of the way of the river. So how are they mapped, these mysterious river corridors? It's really a pretty simple process if you boil it down. So on a meandering river that's not straight, what's first done is a meander center line is created. That's that dashed line in the middle, and it just connects the inflection points of the meandering river to create a straighter pathway. And then on either side of that meander center line are the boundaries of what's referred to as a belt width. And the width of that belt, to create what's referred to as a meander belt, and the width of that belt for alluvial streams flowing through our broad valleys is 6 times the width of the channel. 3 channel widths either side of the meander center line. So for simple math, if the channel's 10 feet wide, that meander belt is going to be 60 feet wide in total. So that's in essence how river corridors are mapped. Okay, so this slide shows both river corridors in yellow as mapped by the state of Vermont. And I should have mentioned that in that last slide. It's the state of Vermont that maps river corridors. And so we see the river corridors in the slide, and we also see the flood hazard areas that are mapped by FEMA, the National Flood Insurance Program. And what we want to show here is simply that in some places, the river corridor is wider than the flood hazard area. In other places, the flood hazard area is going to be wider than the river corridor. That is simply a reflection of the topography and the erodibility of the soils in the valley bottom. I think what's probably most important here is to see that, okay, we can use both of these hazard area maps to provide comprehensive flood hazard mitigation for communities throughout Vermont. You can advance that slide, Allison. Thank you. Okay, this slide is a hypothetical example of an infill mapping. So the legislation in Act 121 that created the authority for DEC to regulate river corridors had a caveat, that DEC must also map those areas within our designated centers. And what I mean by designated centers are our villages, our downtowns, our identified growth areas, that DEC must map in those areas. And in this slide, I'm showing a designated center in the green polygon, right? It's an area, you can see all the small parcels. It's really densely developed. In those designated centers, DEC must map areas that are minimally or sufficiently safe to build, even though they're in the river corridor. And that river corridor, again, is shown in yellow here. Even though they're in the river corridor, those areas, and those are the areas in orange, because they're maybe areas adjacent to buildings that already exist and are already being protected, or areas where the river just doesn't have a tendency to, hasn't demonstrated a tendency to erode. Maybe the bank of the river is comprised of bedrock. For those reasons, those areas are safe enough that we're going to develop those, because we've long recognized that many of our villages and downtowns and growth centers throughout Vermont are located along the banks of rivers. And we can't preclude development in those areas. Those areas are just too important for our economic productivity in these areas to preclude. So with the passage of Act 121, the legislature again mandated that DEC map these areas, so we will be able to continue to develop in our downtown and other designated centers. Okay, this is just a slide on the jurisdiction, the jurisdictional footprint of river corridor protections. And that jurisdiction is defined by the size of the stream. And the size of the stream is a function or a reflection of the amount of land that drains to that stream, to a given point on a stream. We refer to that land area as the drainage area. And where a stream drains more than 2 square miles of land, it has a mapped river corridor, and there will be river corridor protections along that stream. Upstream of the point where the river drains more than 2 square miles of land, there are no mapped river corridors, and DEC will not be regulating river corridors on that stream. So in this slide, if you are on the stream there that's bordered in green, that green is actually the river corridor. And if you're walking up that stream to that first red point, you're still at an area where the drainage area, that polygon shown in blue, is more than 2 square miles. If you keep walking upstream to the next red point, at that next red point, the polygon, that area of land that drains into the stream above that point, is less than 2 square miles. So as you can see, there are no river corridors to be regulated there. Now, that said, municipalities will still have the opportunity to use model language from DEC to regulate those smaller streams if the municipalities choose to do so. Okay, that's a little bit of a nuance, but that is something to keep in mind. Okay, so getting near the end here, considerations for municipalities. The river corridor maps are online at the A&R Atlas or the Flood Ready Atlas. So if you want to go see where river corridors are in your town, on your property, on your friend's property, you can go to the A&R Atlas or the Flood Ready Atlas. Permits for new development and river corridors will be required starting in January 1 in 2028. DEC may delegate authority to interested municipalities. So if a municipality is regulating river corridors or decides they want to regulate river corridors themselves, they want to run the permitting program, DEC has the ability to do that. And the details are to be worked out. I'm guessing that There will be some criteria that need to be passed to assure that the municipality has the capacity to do that. And if so, DEC can hand them that authority. Municipalities may regulate development along smaller streams. That's what I was mentioning in that last slide. And finally, the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, which is the fund that the state has to help municipalities cover their share of disaster recovery when FEMA comes in and helps with that. So sorry, I'm really doing a bad job of this one. When there's a declared disaster, FEMA will come in and pay 75% of a municipality's recovery costs. The state has long funded the ERAF, the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, to help cover their share, the other 25%. River corridor protection by municipalities has been a criteria for getting a higher level of assistance from the state under the ERAF structure. So if you were a town that had adopted river corridors on your own, you would get more money from the state to help cover your cost share. Now that everybody's going to have river corridor protections, it's not really clear what's going to happen to that incentive structure. So we'll have to stay tuned as the rule is being developed. We'll start to learn more. So that's really it, other than to say we have a lot of information. Here's a link to the Flood Safety Act webpage on Vermont's Flood Ready webpage. And finally, this presentation is part of the community outreach and education that was mandated by the legislature. Part of that was a mandate to gather comments and input from residents across the state. So if you would like to provide input, there is a link which you can do that will send that input directly to DEC, and DEC will then put that input in a report that will be delivered to the legislature. And of course, you can contact Allison or myself if you have more questions.
Great. Thanks, Shane. So that concludes this portion of our meeting tonight, talking about efforts to address flooding on more of a statewide level. But we also are joined by many local organizations to the Northeast Kingdom who are going to talk a little bit more about what their organizations do. And so first, we do have Kathy from the Connecticut River Conservancy. So if you would like to kick things off, that'd be great.
Sure, glad to. Thanks so much, Allison and Shane, for the presentation. I'm going to share a couple slides here really quickly. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So again, it's Kathy Erfer. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Connecticut River Conservancy. We work on the entire, essentially eastern half of the state, and do a variety of things, including direct advocacy. We were supportive of this legislation as it moved through the State House. We do community science work. We do a lot of restoration work, which I'm going to go into a little bit more in detail, and then a lot of outreach and education around what affects the Connecticut River and the tributaries of the Connecticut River. So, you know, the bottom issue here, right, is climate change and what is coming our way. I won't go over this, but you know, we know and we have seen increases in precipitation, increases in localized storm, and a precipitation and drought cycle. And so we have to really get in front of this. We're at the beginning of these impacts, and we have to be able to adapt. And you know, our feeling is that the Flood Safety Act is one of the tools that's going to help us to do this. This is an image after Tropical Storm Irene of you know, the sediment flow coming into the Long Island Sound, which was significant. And as an organization, we feel like we have been in a race against time since Tropical Storm Irene, attempting to get as many projects on the ground as possible to build resilience in our communities. And those projects look like dam removals, which in all cases are, lowering the flood stage of the river and providing essentially more flood storage and the ability for our rivers to move more naturally. Here's just a couple examples. Riparian buffer plantings, which, similarly, when the river is coming up and inundating the floodplain, it's really important to have a robust riparian buffer along the edge to slow the water down and protect our infrastructure along our rivers. Upsizing culverts. This one turned into a bridge to really give that river some room to spread out and reduce impacts to infrastructure during floods. This is another example of a culvert that we upsized. That's my colleague Ron Rhodes, who some of you likely know. And then also berm removal works, right? So we have had a tendency to clear after floods, to clear the detritus on our floodplains along the edge of the river. And it's really, this is just doing exactly what Shane was describing. It's creating a flood chute, which is going to increase the energy of floodwaters and the speed of that river as it goes downstream, possibly causing erosion further down. So, and then another tool in the quiver, mixing my metaphors, is stormwater projects to really try to mitigate stormwater, get it to infiltrate, and keep it from hitting our rivers in the first place. So those are a quick example of some of the work that we're doing on the ground. But, I would say we were supportive of this bill. We are supportive of this bill. And this is another really important tool to make sure that we are getting our communities out of the floodway and protecting them as we move into the future in hopefully a much more resilient way. So with that, I will pass it off to, I think, Patrick from Memphremagog Association.
Thanks, Kathy. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to share my screen and let me know if you have any issues. How's that? Everybody see what I'm seeing?
Yes, we can see.
Wonderful. This has all been really superbly helpful information. I mean, as a project manager who works in, the flood mitigation and restoration space, it's encouraging to know that there will be kind of state programs to help facilitate projects. I'm here to kind of explain what the Memphremagog Watershed Association can do for landowners and municipalities and businesses in our watershed. As the map entails, we are pretty limited to what drains to Lake Memphremagog. We can work in Canada, we can work in the United States, we can work in the Coaticook and Tomophobia rivers in the northeast corner of the state of Vermont. But we're kind of, our duty is to this local area, and so it's only a portion of the Northeast Kingdom, but what we have been able to accomplish is definitely in line with what the state and federal government is pushing for, building flood resilience. And I'm just going to share a little bit about the work that we've been involved in around this space. So, before the flood, right, we love to be proactive. Before the flood, we worked with a lot of partners at the state and the region and landowners on the ground to identify areas where there are opportunities for flood storage. Oftentimes that results in a property acquisition or easement, subdivision, perhaps a donation, where we are conserving and protecting and leaving in a natural state in perpetuity properties that are along river corridors within designated floodplains or non-designated floodplains where we can make the case where there's intact or historic wetlands, where we can do work in forested headwaters, the top of the tributaries, to try to slow the water flow before it kind of reaches our developed, villages and downtowns and road crossings. What we see here is an example of a 20 to 30 acre conservation acquisition in Derby, where we are taking an old farm and marginal croplands and turning it back into flood storage. So we've got ditches that we're plugging channels that we're restoring, floodplains that we're enhancing, wetlands that we're reconstructing, all in the sake of storing floodwaters. So where there's private property owners or municipal property owners that want to work towards those end goals, we're here to provide assistance. When the flood has occurred, we are some of the, earlier response entities. We're out there looking at our projects, but we're also out there documenting impacts to town roads, private properties, public lands. We've got shots from places in Morgan and Holland where floods of the 1,000-year intensity just decimated entire neighborhoods and roadways. And so we're out there documenting where are there opportunities for flood buyouts, where is the emergency response most necessary, what sort of documentation can we offer to people who are then going to seek FEMA or Vermont Emergency Management Department funding to mitigate or deal with flood disasters. And then also offering our insight in a technical capacity for long-term resiliency planning, whether it's culverts, bridges, roadways, public lands, private lands management, whatever we can do to kind of provide support to people who, are afflicted with a little bit too much water all at once. When it comes to private properties, we've done a lot of work in our basin to assist private landowners where there's otherwise no capacity to assist them. We bring out our survey equipment, we do topographic and bathymetric surveying, we try to get baseline documentation. Where was the river? Where is it now? Do we need to put it back? Do we need to armor anything? Do we need to give it more room? Do we need to do any hydraulic or hydrologic modeling? Do you need assistance with designs and permits? Do you need a little bit more data collection, whether it's water quality, sediment, or flow? We do have the tools and capacity often to help people kind of achieve, the many goals that are expected between federal, state, local, and regional permitting and grant funding programs. So we're here to help, navigate that. We do a lot of flood modeling where we're doing restoration projects or flood mitigation projects. This is our site down in Derby where we acquired this property and are now looking to increase flood storage so that we can reduce impacts downstream and also improve water quality in the lakes and rivers, adjacent. We work with private landowners to replace culverts. This was a 4-foot pipe made out of a former ski lift tower that we replaced with a 29-foot clear span bridge. This is on a main stem brook leading to Lake Seymour, and it's a huge fishery. This is just upriver. This is a box culvert that we replaced, a 2-foot pipe. A 2-foot pipe that was replaced with a box culvert. Geez, it's on automatic mode here. So we're doing a lot of work to improve fish passage while we're improving water quality. These are encroachments along the rivers that we're removing. And, we're also taking woody debris out of existing culverts, removing flood disaster potential and bringing them to use on restoration projects. We're upgrading town road culverts on back roads, gravel roads, so that beavers can't clog them as readily, so that we can pass flood flows and still have beavers without having to resort to the lethal method. So we're doing a lot of work. If you guys have flood mitigation issues in our area, you know where to find us. We're happy to help. We can bring resources and funding, expertise. So reach out as relevant. And I'll pass it on. I believe we're going to Will.
I think Emily was maybe next
Emily.
on the list.
Got
but-
Emily next.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That was great.
Hi, thanks everyone. Sorry, I have a little bit of a slideshow as well here. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So my name is Emily Finnegan. I'm the district manager for the Caledonia County Natural Resources Conservation District. And all 3 of the NEK conservation districts are here today. So I am tasked with explaining what conservation districts are. There are 14 conservation districts across Vermont. We are county scale units of government. There are some conservation districts that cover a watershed. You can see on this map. The white lines are the district boundaries, and the color blobs are the watersheds that are visible here. We were established by the Soil Conservation Act in 1939, originally as an outreach and education arm of the national NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the federal agency. But we do much more. We still have a close relationship with that agency and the USDA, and we also do quite a bit more that other folks from conservation districts will talk about. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we conservation districts generally do, and then also about a specific process that we sort of steward in our district areas. So in terms of what NRCDs do, we cover a wide variety of subjects: agriculture, natural resources, outreach and education, all working with this center group in the white circle in the center: landowners, farmers, towns, and partners. So I like to say we don't really do any project without a lot of other people involved. And these are sort of the ways that we do it. So the ways that we address soil health, climate resiliency, and economic viability and water quality are through these sort of 5 buckets. Education and outreach. So we plan events and do community meetings, planning and technical assistance, and project coordination, design coordination and implementation. So this is sort of our role as a project manager. So we, at least at Caledonia County Natural Resources Conservation District, we do a lot of similar work to what Patrick, we don't get quite into the technical abilities that Patrick has, but we do a lot of the similar project management for dam removals, culvert replacements, stream restoration, those types of natural resources projects. And then we also work in the agriculture space, helping agricultural landowners meet their requirements from the state, and also work on their soil health and find funding for cover cropping and projects on their farms. And then this last bucket is what I'll spend a little more time talking about. We are tasked with representing the local perspective in policy and programs. So the primary way we do that, and this slide is sort of terrible, but there are parts of it that are good, so that's why I chose to use it. We are sort of stewarding this process called locally led conservation. And basically this is a way for conservation districts to gather input from the community and local conservation partners. So that's like the top line, called local work groups. So we are looking at all the different kinds of conservation plans that apply to Caledonia County. We're asking community members via survey and community meeting, and we're meeting with other partners that work in our area to ask what are the conservation priorities in this area. And then we are consolidating those into what's called a conservation action plan. And the way this relates to flood resilience is that many of the things, at least we've been hearing in Caledonia County, are related to flood resilience. People are saying our priority in Caledonia County is increasing flood resilience in our watersheds, our smaller watersheds. So from that conservation action plan, we can submit what's called a locally led conservation proposal. And the end result of all of this can be a separate sort of like pot of money that's set aside from the EQIP program, which is a program focused on assisting private landowners with conservation. And most people think of EQIP as assisting with cover cropping and agricultural practices, but EQIP actually has a huge variety of practices that can contribute towards flood resilience and other natural resources restoration, wildlife habitat, forestry, all kinds of different things. So we submit that locally led conservation proposal and then can request a certain amount of money that is only, in our case, for Caledonia County landowners. So it reduces competition for those funds and helps get conservation on the ground in the way that people want to see it happen. So it's a way of directly translating local priorities into federal funding. So for the 2026 federal fiscal year, conservation districts across the state directed more than $4 million in federal funds to farmers and other landowners for work on conservation needs identified by local residents through this process. So I'll stop sharing there, and here we can hear from the other conservation districts.
Thanks, Emily.
Emily, and thanks for setting me up to not have to explain exactly what conservation districts are, because that's always a little bit of a task. It's not a simple thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick. Right. Good. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Great. And you can still see it?
Yep.
Perfect. It didn't make it disappear. All right. So my name is Will Marlier. I'm the Lake Watershed Program Specialist with the Orleans County NRCD. I've been in this role for a little bit under a year now, and it's a pretty unique role. We're lucky to be able to have it here in Orleans County, in part because Orleans County has more lakes than any other county in the state. So there's enough work to keep me busy full time. Lakes are an important part of how we manage flooding across the state and across the landscape. It's an important part of the water cycle as a place that, you know, is communicating very closely with these river systems, where rivers both outlet into these lakes and then these lakes outlet into yet more rivers. So I thought that one way that would be useful for me to spend my time was to just briefly go over one of the projects that I'm working on now, which is on Caspian Lake in Greensboro, which is right at the headwaters of the Lamoille River. I'm working on a project on Cemetery Brook, which is one of the main tributaries to Caspian Lake. You can see some lovely drone imagery here taken of one of the less problematic reaches of Cemetery Brook. You can see that it has that nice meander that Shane was talking about earlier. It's got a pretty nice buffer for the most part, except for that hayfield getting pretty close down there on the southern side of it. And you can also see that it's depositing quite a bit of sediment out into the lake where you see that new delta forming. So while this isn't necessarily the problematic part, what you'll see on the next slide is a section where you have that historic straightening going all the way across that left section of the screen here. It's just been channelized and incised over the years. Farmers have gotten closer and closer to it on either side with their hay production. And you'll note the transects on this slide show you exactly how incised this is. So it takes cross sections where you see the blue triangles representing where the channel currently is. And you can see kind of how deeply dug into the landscape it is at various points. Sometimes it looks like there has been maybe historical berming as well, as people tried to keep it in that straight channel. And then these red points are kind of other low points on the landscape where if the channel was reconnected with the floodplain, we could expect potentially the water to settle over time. And so we're going to do exactly that. We're going to work to put the water out of this incised channel and back onto the landscape, give it time to infiltrate and pool and seep into the landscape instead of rushing down in these erosive features, transporting more sediment and picking up in velocity. So we're going to do that by adding over 50 post-assisted log structures into the channel. That will encourage a grading of the channel and then also help it get back out onto these floodplains. And then we'll also be planting about 11 acres with over 4,000 stems of shrubs and different native species that you would find in these kind of low-lying wetland areas. That too will help build up this capacity of wetland areas, floodplains that are actually helping to reduce flooding further down in the channel and help us have healthier waterways. So I'll talk a little bit more generally here about some of the services the Orleans County Natural Resource Conservation District provides. We help do project management similar to the project that I was just talking about. And we can help connect landowners, private landowners, public landowners with a variety of different funding sources. We do program navigation, where sometimes as a landowner, you know that there is a problem or something's not working quite right, but you don't know who you need to talk to. We can always be that first step to help get you in touch with people at the state, people federally, other nonprofits or municipal groups to kind of just help guide you to the next step. We're also available to help understand kind of some of the regulation and how we work with flooding and natural resources, and help connect you with what permit is necessary. And what's really great about conservation districts is that we're non-regulatory organizations. So we won't penalize anyone for breaking any of these rules. We won't report anyone to the state. We can let you know if we notice something so that you can take action to either remediate it or prevent you from crossing any of these boundaries in the first place. We offer some technical assistance as well, although again, I'll say it's not quite as impressive as the technical assistance that MWA boasts. But we can come out and do technical assistance, do surveys and assessments, look at different waterways, and let you know what we think the next step should be after a site visit. We also support our farmers, as Emily was talking about, through a wide range of different services, and we can help connect them with grant funds and get them to their next steps. And we do data collection that helps us understand what our waterways are doing and the quality of the water in those systems, looking at nutrient loading and how to keep our different water systems clean. So that's essentially it from me. If you want to reach out to us to let us know if you've got something going on, we're happy to help in any way that we can. This is the contact information for our executive director, Sarah Damzell, and her email is listed there as well. But yeah, thanks for giving us the time. And yeah, it's been a great program so far. I'm sure it'll continue to be as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Then rounding out our conservation districts, we also have Sam.
All right, hey folks, somebody shout out if you don't see my presentation, but I'm gonna plow ahead. So Sam Main, I'm with the Essex County Conservation District, same as Caledonia and Orleans, but in Essex County. And I want to talk about another area of our work that kind of overlaps with resilience, which has been touched on a bit before, and that's culverts. So, Will just spoke about kind of restoring a stream to its natural form and giving it ability to access its floodplains, keep water there instead of going downstream and causing problems. So that's incredibly important, but we also need to be looking at our stream crossings themselves and making them more resilient. A lot of them have not actually been designed for long-term success in Vermont. As you saw in the presentation earlier, there's frequent, every other year somewhere in Vermont, somebody's getting flooded. And so what we actually need to be doing is upgrading these structures. And you're probably all plenty aware of this, but rural towns don't usually have the money to do these big construction projects for big infrastructure projects, and especially not all at the same time. So what we do is we try to find some of those priority places to do structure upgrades, and we get usually multiple grants together so that we can help offset some of that cost. You're looking at one of those examples here on the left is before, and on the right is during. It's not quite done yet. This is in Lunenburg. And this is the original structure is 15-foot structure, 15 feet wide, on a 30-foot, a little over 30-foot wide stream. And then the structure we put in is actually about 40 feet wide, so that when you get those big flood events, you can get the stream has space to expand and without blowing out the road. So this one was actually first identified for a replacement because it's a total fish passage barrier. So brook trout can't get to the 20 miles of stream upstream of this. So we got money from the Fish and Wildlife Service to get it engineered, designed to have an open bottom and provide that flood resiliency, being so wide. Then we also were able to get a grant from another fish passage grant that was part of the 2023 bipartisan infrastructure law, to cover about 80% of the cost. But then, there's still $200,000 left. So that's still a big cost for a town. So we tapped into the state clean water funds, another grant application to cover the rest of construction. And the reason we could do that is because, in addition to being a flood resiliency issue and a fish passage issue, there's also a bunch of erosion going on underneath the structure here. Enough so, actually, I think I saw Greg on the call here. He can give the details later, maybe. But the town was having to drop loads of gravel on this road earlier last year now, because of the amount of sediment that was just getting sucked down through this structure and into the stream. So that's sediment, and that's nutrients that are a water quality problem. So all told, we got this project done, or are getting this project done, about $1 million at practically no cost to the town. I won't promise that for every stream crossing in your town, but we can often, if it's a priority structure, be able to knock off several $100,000 of cost, if it's if we can justify it. So the other part of kind of road management for flood hazards is the kind of a little bit uphill, the erosion issue on the road itself. So we as an organization help a lot of towns identify these road erosion issues. It's all kind of tied into another state law that went into effect not too many years ago, called the Municipal Roads General Permit. Basically, towns need to manage their roads near streams and other water bodies up to certain standards to prevent erosion. They're all working towards the 2036 deadline. So we identify things like the picture on the left there, which obviously doesn't look too bad on a sunny day, but I think at this point we all know it can quickly turn into the picture in the middle. And then we help get the money through grants to fix these problems. Things like better crown on the roads, stone line ditches like on the right there, upgraded drainage culverts that may not be a stream but still need to be able to handle the amount of water that we get. So in Essex County, I'm already working with most of the towns, though please, if you're not sure that your town's working with me, feel free to get them to get in touch. But I think in the rest of the NEK, it's mostly going to be NVDA that would be your point of contact for this type of work, helping with the MRGP. And again, I will say I'm talking mostly about town road assistance. We also work with private landowners. It's a little more case by case, but always feel free to get in touch. And you've already seen this slide 3 times, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but wetlands, farms, riverbanks, invasive species, whatever natural resources thing, get in touch. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Right, and then last up we have Allison.
Hi. I do not have any slides. We're the Regional Planning Commission for the Northeast Kingdom, all 3 counties. And you are correct that we do road erosion inventories, and we help our towns comply with the MRGP requirements. One of our other primary responsibilities right now is working with the Department of Environmental Conservation to help our towns who are going to be receiving updated FEMA maps. Those FEMA maps are used to administer their flood hazard regulations. As Allison and others have pointed out, there are obviously some significant limitations to flood hazard, the minimum standards of FEMA, which are really focused on protecting the value of the insured structure and they do allow for fill in the flood fringe, which can be detrimental to the neighboring and downstream properties. So while those flood hazard maps are being released, all of those towns are going to be under a 2-year period where they have to bring their flood regulations up to FEMA's minimum standard. However, it's a great time to reassess what we've been doing. And fortunately, the state of Vermont has developed a set of model regulations that integrate the no adverse impact principles that have been referred to in this presentation, such as not decreasing floodplain storage in the flood fringe, and also protecting river corridors. So although the Act 121 establishes new standards for those local regulations, and they officially won't be implemented until 2028, I think it's reasonable to assume that the model regs produced by the DEC and the same set of regulations that we've been working with will queue you up to come into compliance with the Flood Safety Act. So it's a great time to start engaging with your community and talking about why it's important to take a watershed approach to managing flood hazards. So that's basically it. We do that technical assistance. I don't really have any sexy slides for working on regulations, however. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, so that is all of our local partners. I just really enjoyed hearing from all of you just now, because it's nice to hear about all the different types of projects and priorities and initiatives that are happening around the region. I think it helps put into perspective how many organizations and groups and people are working on issues related to flooding and water quality and other natural resource topics. So because that's the end of our presentations, I was trying to look into the chat to see if there was questions that hadn't gotten answered, but if folks do have questions, now's a great time to ask them. Feel free to come off mute or raise your hand or put them in the chat. The one thing I did see here is that Pat mentioned culvert crawlers as a program. We actually will be talking about that tomorrow night. If you want to hear some of this again, Kelly Stetner from Black River Action Team will be joining us to talk about that project. And so that is a great regional initiative. But any questions from folks online?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Ann Lawless. I'm on the Wheelock Select Board, and I hate seeing that map of all the towns in the state that belong to the National Flood Insurance Program, because we do not in Wheelock, and it's discouraging to see that most of those towns, like us, are in our region here. But listening to this really excellent presentation, I'm thinking, gee whiz, maybe there's not that much point in our town trying to push to get those regulations passed, because it seems like the state is going to be helping in a couple of years take some of that responsibility away. I mean, if we or basically to help towns with some of that responsibility. And then there's also the question of is the National Flood Insurance Program going to survive the current federal administration? So hoping to hear all your insights. Thank you.
Allison, I saw your hand shot up, and also Sasha has her hand, so both of you can can take this one.
I can't provide a crystal ball for what's going to happen with FEMA, so I'm going to punt on that one. But keep in mind that the reason that our communities participate in the National Flood Insurance Program is to ease the pain when their property gets flooded, whether or not they are in a mapped floodplain. So they could be in a river corridor, but not in a mapped floodplain. And if they had that insurance, they would at least have the greatest chance of being made whole. So, so usually what happens is that we end up with a community where like somebody gets flood damage, they go to the bank, they try to get out a loan, and the bank says, you've already been damaged by flooding once before, now you have to get some flood insurance. Well, it's really hard to get it outside of the National Flood Insurance Program. The other thing is that, and I think that Allison mentioned this briefly, is that the flood insurance is automatically required for any federally backed mortgages on a home. So if you do have a home that's in a floodplain, you're going to have a hard time selling it unless somebody comes along with a suitcase full of cash. So the insurance exists to make somebody whole. It did exist also as an incentive to increase the town's share under ERAF, and it's not certain, you know, what will happen after that. But I'm not saying that the flood insurance, like the minimum standards, don't matter. It's just that they're really focused on protecting their value of the insured structure, which makes sense because it's an insurance program. That's all.
Sasha, do you have anything to add to that too?
Sure. I mean, Allison really covered it nicely. The NFIP has benefits for communities to participate. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the River Corridor program really is focusing on the stream's movement over time and that erosion hazards that Shane and Allison touched on, whereas you still have, communities still have inundation hazards. And so the state will only be directed to take jurisdiction under the Flood Safety Act in the river corridors that drain more than 2 square miles of land. So, you know, communities still have an active role in determining how development occurs along your streams and in floodplains. And so it's very important. The National Flood Insurance Program, well, actually, the Flood Safety Act is also asking for the state to go through rulemaking to determine minimum standards to be in the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a change for Vermont because right now you can participate just based on, you know, what FEMA has determined are the minimum standards. So when that happens, you know, communities will be looking at their bylaws, and that's what Allison was touching on, is like we're at this moment where we're getting new FEMA flood maps in a lot of places, which is amazing since many of them are quite old. They're going to be so much better, hopefully. And then also we're at this moment where there's going to be this state minimum standard coming through, which means that a community has to adopt certain standards in order to be in the National Flood Insurance Program. So anyway, there's a lot to it, but we've talked about this before, Anne. You know, I think it would be great if Wheelock were to be able to join, but it is a tricky thing for small communities, and that's where like Alexis and I and others in the DC Rivers program have really tried to support small communities and NVDA as well in making that step, that leap. But there are benefits with disaster recovery funds outside of ERAF as well. You know, what community is eligible for will be or has been based on whether you participate in the National Flood Insurance Program or not. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. Any other questions from folks?
Allison, I'll just add in response, and
Yeah.
just one more for just if you're looking, like if you I just think about the soundbite response. And, for me, it's like we have both inundation and erosion hazards. If we employ the NFIP and the river corridor protections, we can establish comprehensive protections, right? That's like in a nutshell, that's really what it boils down to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have another one.
All right.
Sure.
What is the overlay, the towns that do not have flood, that are not in the National Flood Insurance Program and that do not have zoning? Our town has neither. And people tell us when we had those meetings to try to get people to go after, to support the flood insurance program, they felt that having that person who had to come into their house and look at whether they were going to make a $150 improvement, they felt that was very intrusive. And especially when that comes from someone who's their neighbor in their town. So if there was a way for towns to easily share the officer who has to do that unhappy job, that would be helpful. I mean, we actually found someone in Burke, a guy, the gentleman who's doing that seemed willing and available to help us. But by that time, it seemed like the program was going to go nowhere. And I think what happened then was maybe we got flooded. And and we couldn't work on that anymore because we were dealing with flooding. So I don't know. But back to what I first said, what's the overlap between towns that don't have zoning and towns that are not in the NFIP?
Not as big as you think.
Really?
Craftsbury, Coventry, what other towns all of a sudden, of course, I'm blanking. Glover, thank you. All participate in the NFIP, and have famously resisted zoning over the years. So it is possible for people to unpack that concept from, some kind of encroachment. I know that in Craftsbury, it was triggered by, somebody approached the town select board and said, I'm in a bind, I can't sell my house. They were in that same situation that I talked about. So that's what precipitated the whole dialogue. We do have some towns that use circuit riders. We have in nearly all of our towns, the floodplain administrator is also, if they do have zoning, it's the zoning administrator. We don't have separate staff for that. It sounds like a great idea, but I also worry that a circuit rider could become overwhelmed in the event of an actual flood when they're trying to make substantial damage determinations. So I think they would need some backup. And there are organizations out there that can do that kind of thing, like the state Association of State Floodplain Managers has some kind of program that provides that support. It's definitely something that we can look into. But the bottom line here is that, those towns that adopted floodplain regulations 20 some odd years ago, it was not an eventual march to zoning.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is it's not easy to administer floodplain regulations in your community, but at the same time, it's a way for the town to take ownership over its own flood risks and work together to kind of come to a better understanding of what's happening in terms of development in those areas and talking to your neighbors. And it's not easy work, but I think it's, well, it's not about what I think, but um, but I mean, the reality is like it wouldn't really, even if the state had the capacity to regulate floodplains and river corridors in every corner of Vermont, even if we did, it wouldn't make sense because we have communities who are better positioned to understand what the local flood dynamic is, what the neighbor dynamic is. So I think it's an opportunity for a town to kind of make decisions for themselves in a way.
Thanks, Sasha. Any other questions from folks in our last 5 minutes? You can send questions after the fact to any of us, you know, if it's similar questions to what we've just had, definitely Allison, Alexis, or Sasha are good resources, or looks like we've had some contact info put into the chat as well for some of our other regional organizations. Al has your hand up.
Is that you?
Yeah,
Hey,
go
this is
ahead.
Val Kenny in Island Pond. At Bridge 14 on 114 on the south downstream side. They installed the bridge in 2000. I talked with a surveyor for 4 years prior to the installation of that bridge, and I showed him the blueprints. And I told them that they were going to wash out the Farron River flood zone in a short period of time if they put the bigger bridge in on Bridge 25, a 19-foot bridge, 4.5 feet open to the river. They put in a 30-foot bridge, 5.5 feet high. They raised it 26 inches. I told them they were going to hydraulically excavate the valley in a short period of time. I told them the short period of time was 25 years. It's happened in 20. It's been 26. The suckers stopped spawning at the bridge 4 years ago. You people are doing a great job talking about doing an awful lot of stuff out there. And it's all where the flood zones used to be. The problem is you got to stop the water before it gets there. Natural Resources has caused this problem with their road subsidy plan. Every time you take out a 12-inch culvert, you put in a 2-foot culvert. You got to double the size of the culverts. What do you do when you do that? You triple the volume going downstream. You dig the ditches on the upstream side and you force the water to stay on the upstream side of the roads. And this is going on all the way from the Canadian border. It's not just Essex County and Caledonia and Orleans. All the way. It's a crying shame. The deeper you dig the ditches, the faster the water goes. And there's a big problem with the way of the contracts are read in the sub captions at the bottom of the diagrams is hydraulic improvements. The statement hydraulic improvements. What is your definition of a hydraulic improvement? Anyone on the panel?
I see Patrick, you have your hand up.
A hydraulic improvement sounds good to anybody that has a water problem. The definition of a hydraulic improvement is an increase of volume and an increase of velocity, in which causes.
Patrick wants to answer your question.
Huh?
Patrick wants to answer your question.
Yeah, go ahead, Patrick. If you
Hey,
have
Al.
something to add.
And hi, Al's wife, I presume. Thanks for bringing up those points. Those are really important points. I hear you on a lot of those things, especially the ditching. one thing that we call ditches around here are bum ass ditches, because oftentimes they are dug in such a way as to exacerbate problems that already exist, in the hopes of solving a problem in a very small local area, and then shunting that problem downstream to the neighbors. So yeah, we work on a lot of ditches, and I hear your frustrations with that. I will counter one point you made in terms of like the pipes, you know, the upsizing of the pipes. Wherever we can increase culvert diameter, we're also trying to address the slopes of those culverts, the constrictions that they pose, the velocities that they create. You know, and if you have a small pipe with a large drainage area, you have a reducer, right? It's like putting a half-inch coupler on a 2-inch water main, right? You're going to get a lot of pressure. So we try to relieve that pressure by providing an adequately sized culvert or bridge, so that the velocity doesn't change. And
I'm
so
very
that the
hard to
sediment.
hear. And there's a few other things that I'd like to say about the water problem.
Okay,
And
so do you want me to stop talking and you continue? I'm happy to do so.
But I don't know if you answered my question, but the definition of the phrase. Another reason the water is running like this is like in 2000, they put this bridge in at my house in the year 2000. And that was 2000, and they finished up the bridge on early December of that year. The very next spring, they created the Friends of Kayaks and Canoes, and they went down. It's a 65-foot fall from Island Pond here to Cozy Corner out where 114 comes into 105 west of the village. And the kayak people went down through and cut out all of Mother Nature's hydraulic brakes, about 4 or 5 large log jams in the fall down below the sewer plant. And that's been going on for 26 years. They, what the heck? I guess I gotta say some other stuff. When they put the bridge in at my house, December 26th, it was December 10th on 2000. They finished it. And it started raining when they drove the equipment over the bridge. And the next morning, there was 8 inches of water in 114 between my bridge and the upstream bridge 500 feet up. And they said that the upstream bridge was going to control the hydraulics of the downstream bridge. And I told them there was no way that they was going to do that. And I worked with like 4 years before they installed the bridge. I got to know the engineer quite well. For 4 seasons, they worked surveying from the railroad station, Community National Bank, to the north on 114 to 5 Mile Square Road, the Iron Bridge on a railroad tracks. Took them 4 years.
So
and,
Al, can I just jump in a little bit? I just want to keep us on task here, because we got a lot of people from a huge geographic area. And I just want to mention that, like, I hear you, like, bridges and culverts are a complicated matter. And you got a lot of people in this room who are willing to listen to you talk about which bridges you have concerns about. Hold on, one second. But I don't think this is the forum to do that. I think you have a lot of people here with contact information that we can talk to you directly about these particular issues. But we want to make sure that this is open to the broader audience of the region, which is 52 towns and counties, or 52 towns in the 3 counties. So I just want to make sure that we're giving everybody else equal space to bring up questions and concerns.
Thanks, Patrick. We are at our 7:30 cutoff, so I want to be respectful of folks' time. And like Patrick mentioned, there's a whole host of experts on this call, especially your watershed groups and your conservation districts are going to be great resources for any kind of specific issues that you are seeing on the landscape or on your property. A lot of them, I'm sure, do consultations and things like that around specific issues. So thanks everybody for joining tonight, and definitely reach out with any further questions. We've got plenty of experts to answer them. So thanks everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Good evening.